question. How many of you have been watching the Olympics? Okay, turn to your neighbor and tell them your favorite event. What is it that you like most about the Olympics? Quickly. Now, let me ask you this question. For the last 3 to 15 years, what has been the primary focus of every Olympic athlete? What's been the primary focus? What have they been doing for the last 3 to 15 years? Anybody practice? Wrong. Deliberate practice. Yeah, there's a mistaken idea out there that practice makes perfect. It doesn't. Perfect practice makes perfect. And one of the elements of deliberate practice I'd like to talk with you about. But let me have you imagine this. Can you think of any would-be Olympic athlete going out and hiring a coach with the following admonition? I only want you to tell me the good things I'm doing. I don't want any opportunities for improvement. I don't want any course corrections. Just reinforce the good things. Reasonable? No. Because here's the deal. Athletes do something that the rest of us sometimes don't do. They seek, they get, and they use feedback. Some of us don't seek it. We wait until someone gives it to us. Some of us, once we have the feedback, we actually don't use the feedback. So how do we get on this bandwagon? Because every Olympic athlete knows that feedback is the breakfast of champions. In fact, it's not just the breakfast, it is the lunch and the dinner of athletes. They understand that every piece of information that is given them. So you tell me to lower my center of gravity, tuck my elbow in, which may take 1,000th of a second off the clock and allows me to stand on the podium with that medal around my neck. Every piece of feedback is valuable. Now, years ago, Wheaties coined this phrase, and many Olympic athletes have been seen on the outside of a Wheaties box. And while I don't deny that nutrition is a valuable thing, I'm going to suggest to you that there's something beyond nutrition. And here's the reason why. When you withhold feedback from others, you are withholding their future from them. Now, that's not just true in the athletic world, it is also true in the corporate world. Several years ago, I received a phone call from the CEO of a hospital that had been voted the hospital of the decade, if you can imagine that. When you took a look at their patient satisfaction scores, when you took a look at their engagement scores, they were off the chart. And when the CEO called me up, he said, Stace, I'd like you to come out and I'd like you to spend a day with my senior staff because while we have accomplished incredible things, there is nothing that fails like success. And I want my team to understand how to give and receive feedback. Now, by the way, those are two separate skills. How do you give it? How do you receive it? Now, what we have to understand is this, is that there is a limiting factor in all feedback and communication. So let me give you just about 30 seconds at your table, and I want you to kind of break this apart. I'm not looking for a limiting factor. I am looking for the limiting factor of all feedback and communication. Check it out with your colleagues. What do you think it is? All right. Let's check it out. Let me tell you what it isn't. It is not the riskiness of the message that you need to share, but it is how safe you can help me feel hearing the message. How many of you got it? Got a few out there. Yeah. And of course, this is a quote from Carrie Patterson and Joseph and David, etc. What an interesting, we often measure the risk and say, I don't think I could share that with you. And when you withhold the feedback from me, you're withholding my future. Here's the challenge. It's not that I can't hear you. It's just that I don't feel safe listening to you. Now, there is a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is a function of physiology. Can I pick up the wavelengths? Which my wife is telling me that I can't recently. But she says I can't figure out why it's only my voice intonation that you can't pick up. I haven't figured that out yet. Listening is a function of the heart. And if I don't feel safe with you, I may hear you, but I am not listening to what you have to say. Now, I had an interesting experience actually a couple of years ago now. I was doing some training in the middle of a cornfield outside of St. Louis at a manufacturing plant. And when I had finished the 2 days of training, the HR director who had set this up came to me and she said, well, what do you think of our new training room? I said, it's awesome. She said, this is the first training that has ever taken place in this room. And then she paused and she said, oh, by the way, this is not just a training room. This is a safe room. I said, safe room? She said, yeah. She said, this room has been constructed to withstand an F5 tornado. And she took me over to the walls, and they were about this thick. And there were about 6 hinges on the door that weighed about 150 pounds, etc. And I thought, this is really ironic. I have spent 2 days talking about psychological safety in a room that is actually constructed to physically keep us safe. And I begin thinking about some of the parallels that exist, because when you begin looking at a safe room, one of the most significant parts of the construction is how they have taken rebar, this reinforcing bar, and they have actually placed it within the concrete so that it creates a tension that allows strength to actually encompass everyone in that room. And I got to thinking about this relative to giving feedback. And my question is, how safe could I make it if I were to take the rebar of mutual purpose and I were to thread this through the environment in which I'm giving feedback? If I were to take the rebar of mutual respect and I were to thread this very carefully through the environment of which I am giving feedback. Because if you believe that I care about what you care about, and you believe that I care about you, I can listen to almost anything that you say. And if I do this well, even when I'm getting feedback that perhaps is harsh or critical, I have the capacity to step back and to reweave this environment that seems to be hostile, because I can begin to neutralize what you're saying to me, taking the sting out of it and learning to even embrace negativity, understanding that what you may be giving me is a gem of feedback that no one has ever given me. In fact, if you do this well, you can make it safe to share the last 10%. Now, Harvard Business School, Harvard University, decided to study a church outside of Chicago called the Willow Creek Church, because there had been such rapid growth in this church in a very short period of time. And as they went in and they began to study the culture of this church, they weren't looking for theology, they were looking for what was happening within the culture of this organization that generated this kind of intense interest. And one of the things that they found is that the pastor, Bill Hybels, had instituted something within the culture of that organization, and this was what he said. When you and I, in essence, are having a crucial conversation, before the conversation is over, I'm going to ask you this question. What's the last 10% that you'd like to share with me? How often have you and I been in a conversation? Somebody's asked for feedback on a project, on a paper, a presentation, and you've had reservations, but you didn't think you could pull those reservations out and actually share them, and you have withheld the last 10% that may be actually the difference between my success and my failure. Now, let me share with you my life coach. And this Saturday, we will be celebrating 44 years of coaching me, all right? She is my fiercest critic, my most loyal friend, and she has become a sharer of the last 10%. We were driving in the car not too long ago on the way to one of my grandson's basketball games when she leaned over to me in the car and she said, "Could I give you some feedback?" I said, "Sure." She hesitated and she says, "Well, I'm a little concerned." I said, "You're kidding." I said, "Please, it's safe." She hesitated again, and then she said, "Are you aware of how you are interacting with the basketball officials at your grandson's games?" I said, "Me?" She said, "Yes, you." I said, "I've made a couple of comments." She said, "No, you've made more than a couple of comments." I continued to drive down the road not saying anything, and after about 5 minutes, she leaned in toward me and she said, "Have we gone to silence?" Dangerous to present this material to people, isn't it? I said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I have," but I said, "The reason that I have is this is pretty challenging." I said, "By the way, who said something to you?" She said, "Your daughter." I said, "How long ago?" She said, 2 weeks ago. I said, "You've got to be kidding me." And as we continued to talk, this is the last 10% that she shared. She said, "Are you wanting your grandchildren to cringe when they see you walk into the gymnasium?" And that had a profound effect on me, and here's why it had the profound effect. This is one of the teams that I coached, and the gentleman in the far right-hand side that actually has hair, okay, is me a few years ago. And one of the things that I had a chance to do in my doctoral dissertation is study sport and moral reasoning. And everyone who played on our team had to take a 2-hour class from me, and we had a sports person's code that made it clear that you could not speak to an official during the game. It was a code of mutual respect. And what had I started to violate? The very thing that I stood for, and she was able to share that information, and as Albert Bandura so artfully says, it's not that I was amoral, but I was in moral slumber, and when she shared the feedback with me, it brought me out of my moral slumber. Now, this was 6 games before the end of the season, and I got to tell you, I have done really well except for one game. And I actually caught myself in the midst of this and pulled myself back. In fact, the very last game of the season, it was a home game, pretty hotly contested, and at one point an official made a call and 2 parents immediately sprung to their feet, one from the opposing team, one from our home team, and one of them actually stepped out on the court. At the first timeout, the athletic director came over, and I could see that they were having a discussion. I was sitting in the other stands. And he escorted them both out of the gymnasium. And I turned to my wife and I said, "Friends, I haven't even been tempted." Why? Because she was able to share the last 10%. And she was able to anchor it to something that I deeply held and I deeply believed in. This is the interesting thing. It's a paradox of life that the less we look at our shortcomings, the more others do. Henry Cloud. Now, here's my admonition. There is a need to learn from Olympic athletes because Olympic athletes are proactive. They go out and ask. They don't wait until somebody gives. And when they get that information, they actually use it. So my challenge to you right now is have you been withholding the last 10%? Are you withholding that person's future? How could you make it so safe to create mutual purpose and to thread mutual respect, that rebar, into the environment in which you share this information that could have a profound impact upon their life? So my challenge to you is, within the next week and a half, I want you to hold yourself accountable to start looking at, who do I need to share some feedback with? But this is the most important one. I want you to go out and seek it from somebody else. Think about becoming vulnerable enough to walk up to your boss and say, "What's it like being on the other end of me?" Or to your spouse, like I did the other day to my wife, Sandra. I said, "What's it like living with me?" And she said, "How long do you have?" Just kidding. Who do you need to talk with? Because at the end of the day, this is about having authentic relationships. And when you and I are not talking about the real thing, when you and I are not sharing the last 10%, we're not having authentic relationships. We're not having live encounters. And you're not moving towards your peak. Seek, get, and use feedback. And you will find yourself moving across the finish line as an authentic person with authentic relationships and authentic results. Thank you very much.